The morning Tobias Maddox rode into Cutter's Creek with a leather satchel full of foreclosure papers. The sky above the Texas panhandle was the color of a bruise, and the wind carried the smell of rain that had not yet decided to fall. He had ridden 3 days from Amarillo, through red clay canyons, and across flat stretches of prairie that seemed to swallow a man whole, and he had told himself the whole way that this was just business. It was always just business. That was what you said when the work made your stomach tighten and your jaw lock up. You said it was just business, and you kept your eyes forward, and you did not think too hard about the face that would be waiting at the end of the road. Tobias was 28 years old, lean and sun-darkened, with brown eyes that had seen enough of the world to have lost some of their softness but not quite all of it. He worked as a field agent for the First Cattlemen's Trust of Amarillo, which was a fine-sounding name for an institution that loaned money to ranchers, and then came to collect when those ranchers could not pay. It was the year 1882, and the cattle economy of the Texas Panhandle had been lurching along like a 3-legged horse for the past 2 seasons. Drought had hammered the grazing land. Markets in Abilene had dropped. Men who had borrowed against their herds were finding themselves caught between what they owed and what their cattle could earn, and the bank did not wait for seasons to turn. The foreclosure notice in Tobias's satchel was for one Jane Shepard of the Running S Ranch, located 7 miles east of the small town of Cutter's Creek. The note on her herd was 14 months overdue. The balance was $940, which in 1882 was enough to break a working ranch in half. The bank had sent 2 written notices already. Both had gone unanswered, or rather, both had been answered with a single page in a woman's steady handwriting that said she intended to pay but needed more time, and that she had faith the cattle prices would recover, and that she thanked the bank for its patience. The bank's patience, Tobias had been informed by his supervisor Clarence Hollies, was fully exhausted. He stopped at the single-street town of Cutter's Creek long enough to water his horse, a bay gelding named Drum, and to ask the man at the livery stable for directions to the Running S. The liveryman, a heavy-set fellow with a sun-peeled nose, gave him a long look. "You riding out to see Jane Shepard?" the man asked. "I am," Tobias said. The liveryman scratched the back of his neck. "She knows you are coming. She received correspondence from the bank. Whether she chose to understand it fully is another matter." The liveryman made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "She understood it," he said. "She has been working that herd 6 days a week since March trying to make enough to keep them off her. She lost her father last winter. It has been a hard year for that woman." Tobias heard the warning in it. He tightened Drum's cinch without looking up. "I am just here to deliver notice," he said, which was not entirely true. He was there to deliver notice, and if the money was not forthcoming within 30 days, to begin the legal process of seizing the cattle. He knew that. The liveryman probably knew that too. Neither of them said it out loud. The road out to the Running S wound through scrubby mesquite and crossed 2 dry creek beds before opening onto a stretch of grassland that, despite the drought, still held patches of grama, grass the color of old wheat. The ranch itself came into view slowly, the way things did on the flat Texas prairie, first a windmill, then the roofline of a barn, then the low shape of a house with a covered porch running the length of it. There were cattle in the near pasture, maybe 40 head of longhorns, their horns catching what little light the clouded sky offered. They were thin but alive. Someone had been feeding them through a hard season. He slowed Drum as he came into the yard, taking in the details the way a man in his line of work learned to do. The fencing was repaired in places with new lumber. The barn had a fresh patch on its roof. The house itself was modest but kept, with curtains in the windows and a kitchen garden off to the side, the last of the summer squash still clinging to their vines. Someone had worked hard here. Someone continued to work hard here. The front door of the house opened before he had finished dismounting. She came out onto the porch with a rifle held loosely in one hand, not pointed at him but not put away either, and Tobias thought that was about the most honest greeting he had received in a long career of unwelcome arrivals. She was somewhere close to his own age, 26 or so, with dark hair pulled back at the neck and flour on the front of her apron, which told him she had been baking when she heard him ride up and had thought to grab the rifle before she came to see who it was. That was not fear. That was plain good sense for a woman living alone on the Texas frontier. She was striking in a way that had nothing to do with softness. Her face was angular and weathered just enough to show she lived outdoors, and her eyes were gray, the kind of gray that made you think of storm clouds and river water at the same time. She looked at him the way someone looks at a thing they have been expecting and have been dreading in equal measure. "Jane Shepard," Tobias said. "I know who I am," she said. "Who are you?" "Tobias Maddox. I am from the First Cattlemen's Trust of Amarillo." The gray eyes moved to his satchel and then back to his face. "I see," she said. She leaned the rifle against the door frame. "You had better come in then." He tied Drum to the porch rail and followed her inside, ducking slightly under the door frame because the house had been built for a shorter time and a shorter man. The interior was clean and spare, the kind of clean that came from discipline and not from abundance. There was a cookstove with something that smelled of beans and corn bread on it, a table with 4 chairs though only one showed signs of regular use, a pair of shelves with a small collection of books, and a braided rug on the floor that had seen many years. On the wall above the table hung a framed photograph of a man and a woman taken in a studio somewhere, stiff and formal the way people in photographs were, but you could see the man's hand resting on the woman's shoulder with a tenderness that no photographer's instruction could have put there. Jane caught him looking at it. "My parents," she said. "My mother passed when I was 15. My father ran this ranch until last December." "I was told," Tobias said. "I am sorry for your loss." She pulled out a chair for him and sat down across the table, folding her hands in front of her in a way that suggested she was holding herself very still on purpose. "You did not ride 3 days from Amarillo to be sorry," she said. "You rode here to foreclose." He set his satchel on the table but did not open it yet. "The bank has sent 2 notices. The note is 14 months past due." "I know what the note is," she said. "I wrote the letters you received. Did you read them?" "I read them." "Then you know I am not running from this debt. I have been doing everything I can. I lost 11 head to the dry summer. The prices in Abilene dropped by 1/3. I hired on a hand through the spring to help with the calving, and that cost me what little savings I had. But I still have 43 head out in that pasture, and if the prices hold this fall, I can drive them to the railhead and clear at least $400. I am asking for 6 more months. Tobias was quiet for a moment. He had heard versions of this speech before in other kitchens at other tables from other people who owed the bank money and believed the situation was recoverable. Sometimes they were right. More often they were not. The bank did not make its decisions based on belief. "The bank has authorized me to offer a 60-day extension," he said. "Not 6 months." Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. 60 days is not enough time to get a herd to market and back with payment. "I understand that." "Do you?" She looked at him steadily. "Because it sounds like you are offering me a window that is designed to fail." That landed harder than he expected, because it was true enough to sting. 60 days was what the bank offered when it wanted to say it had offered something without actually changing the outcome. He had carried that kind of paperwork before and he knew what it was. "Miss Shepard," he began. "Mrs. Shepard," she said. "Or Jane, my husband died 4 years ago, I kept the name." He nodded, recalibrating. "Jane, I am going to be straight with you. The bank wants these cattle. Not because they are worth more than the note, but because they want to set a precedent. There are 11 other ranchers in this county behind on their notes, and the bank wants to demonstrate that it collects. That is the honest truth of why I am sitting at this table." She was quiet for a long moment. Outside, one of the longhorns in the near pasture made a low sound, and the wind moved through the mesquite along the fence line. The kitchen smelled of coffee and corn bread and the particular stillness of a life being lived under pressure, "Why are you telling me that?" she finally said. "That is not something a bank agent usually says." "No," he agreed, "it is not. So why?" He looked at his hands on the table. He was not entirely sure. He had ridden into this yard prepared to be professional and efficient, and to do what he had come to do. He had not planned to sit across from a woman who held a rifle like she knew what it was for, and asked him direct questions, and had flour on her apron from baking bread on the same morning she expected to have her livelihood taken from her. "Because you deserve to know what you are actually up against," he said, "so that you can make whatever decisions need making." Jane Shepard looked at him for a long time. Then she stood up and went to the stove and poured 2 cups of coffee without asking if he wanted one, which was another kind of honest, and set one in front of him and sat back down. "Tell me what I am actually up against," she said. So he told her. He told her about the bank's board, who were sitting in their offices in Amarillo looking at a ledger full of bad debts and making decisions that had nothing to do with the people whose names were on those debts. He told her about Clarence Hollies, who had been his supervisor for 3 years and who had once been a rancher himself, before the bank had foreclosed on his operation. And then, in a particular kind of cruelty that the world sometimes delivered, hired him on to foreclose on others. He told her about the pattern he had seen, the way the bank moved through a community, acquiring cattle at below-market rates and reselling to the large operations that had the money to wait out a bad season. He did not know why he was telling her all of this. He told himself it was because she had asked, and she had a right to know. He told himself it was because the work had been sitting wrong with him for a long time, and this kitchen, with its braided rug and its books and the photograph on the wall, was just the morning when it all finally curdled. Jane listened to every word without interrupting. When he finished, she turned her coffee cup in her hands and looked at the window for a while. The clouds outside had broken just enough to let a thin wash of sunlight come through, and it fell across the table between them. "What would you do?" she asked. "If you were me, I would get that herd to market before the 60 days run out," he said. "The best you can do right now is get $400 in hand and come back to the bank with that and a formal renegotiation request. It will not clear the note, but it changes the conversation. Banks do not like to foreclose on partially paid debt if there is a credible repayment plan. It opens them up to legal challenge if the terms were not exhausted." She looked at him sharply. "That sounds like advice you are not supposed to be giving." "Probably not," he said. "But there it is." For the first time since he had arrived, the tension in her face shifted into something that was not quite a smile, but was in the neighborhood of one. It changed her entirely, that almost smile, and Tobias felt something shift in his chest that he was not going to examine too closely, not yet, not sitting at this table with a foreclosure notice in his satchel. "I have been trying to find a drover to take the herd north," she said. "My regular man, Abel Coates, took a job with the 3-Bar Ranch in May when I could not pay his wage. I have 43 head and no one to help me move them." "How far is the railhead?" "The nearest is Willow Flat." "About 60 miles north." 60 miles with a herd of longhorns was a 4-day drive minimum, even under good conditions. Alone it was not possible. "You have no neighbors who could help?" She shook her head slowly. "The nearest ranch is the Pullman place, and Davis Pullman has been making it very clear since my father died that he would be happy to purchase the running S at a price I would describe as generous if you were a vulture and not a man." She said it flatly, without self-pity, just a woman naming the facts of her situation. "There is a family, the Garcias, who lease the water rights on the east pasture from me. Miguel Garcia is a good man, but he has 4 children and his own work." Tobias sat with that for a moment. He thought about the road back to Amarillo. He thought about his report to Clarence Hollies, which was supposed to arrive within a week of his departure. He thought about all the very good reasons why what he was considering was a profoundly poor professional decision. "I know the drive," he said. "I spent 4 years working cattle before I took the bank job. I know the trail north to Willow Flat." Jane Shepard set her coffee cup down very carefully. "What are you saying?" I am saying that I rode out here with a job to do, and the job is giving me trouble. He looked at her steadily. I am saying I have not taken a real week off in 2 years, and the bank is not going to care one way or the other whether I ride back today or in 10 days, as long as I file the report when I get back. The report you would file being what, exactly? The report I would file, he said slowly, working it out as he spoke, would say that the debtor has demonstrated credible intent to repay, and that I am recommending a 90-day extension pending a partial payment to be received at the bank's Amarillo office upon the conclusion of a cattle drive to market. She stared at him. You would do that? I would help you drive those cattle to Willow Flat, he said. After that, what happens is between you and the bank. I cannot promise they will accept the extension, but with $400 in hand and a partial payment to show, you have a chance. The silence that followed was not empty. It was the kind of silence that holds a decision in it, that stretches between two people while one of them weighs the strange gift they have just been offered and tries to understand the shape of it. Why, she said, I am asking you for a real answer, not the professional one. Why would you do this? Tobias was quiet for a longer moment than was comfortable. The coffee had gone cool in his cup. Outside, drums shifted at the rail, and the wind picked up again, and somewhere in the pasture a calf called for its mother. Because I have been doing this work for 3 years, he finally said, and every time I ride away from a ranch after delivering those papers, I tell myself it is just business, and every time I believe it a little less. And because he stopped. Because what? She said very quietly. He met her eyes, those gray eyes that held the color of river water and storm clouds. Because you made me coffee, he said. And that seems like exactly the wrong reason to help a person, which probably means it is the right one. Jane Shepard looked at him for one more beat, and then she did smile, properly this time, and it was the kind of smile that rearranges things. All right, Tobias Maddox, she said. You can stay for supper, and we will start with the cattle in the morning. That first evening, they talked more than Tobias had talked in months, which surprised him because he had never thought of himself as a man who needed to talk. They sat on the porch after supper, with the last of the daylight going gold on the horizon and the cattle settling in the near pasture, and she told him about the ranch and her father, a man named Harold Shepard who had come to the Texas panhandle in 1869 with $40 and a pair of breeding cows, and had built the running S from nothing but stubbornness and early mornings. She told him about her husband, Will Shepard, who had been Harold's nephew and who had died of a fever in the winter of 1878, leaving her with a half-built ranch and a grief that she had not entirely finished with even now. She did not tell these things the way someone seeking sympathy tells them. She told them the way you might describe the landscape, as things that had shaped the ground you were standing on. Tobias found himself listening with a quality of attention he did not usually bring to conversations, the kind where you hear not just what is said, but the weight of what is not. In return, she asked him questions. Not surface questions, but real ones, the kind that caught him slightly off guard. Where had he come from before Amarillo? He told her about the small farm in East Kansas where he had grown up, one of 4 boys, and how the farm had failed when he was 17 because of a flood that took the bottomland crops 2 years running, and how his father had taken work laying telegraph wire, and the family had scattered the way families do when the center does not hold. He had gone west because west was where you went when you needed to become someone other than who you had been, which was a very 1870s kind of logic and also, he said, not entirely untrue. She laughed at that, and the sound of it was like something opening in the evening air. He slept that night in the barn, on a bedroll in the clean hay, which was a considerably better arrangement than several nights he had spent on the trail, and he lay awake for a while looking at the cracks of starlight between the barn boards and thinking about what he had done. He had committed to helping a woman he had met 8 hours ago. He had committed to recommending a bank extension that his supervisor would almost certainly reject. He was going to be late returning to Amarillo. He was, by any reasonable professional measure, handling this assignment very badly. He went to sleep feeling more like himself than he had in quite some time. They started before dawn. Jane had already been up when he came out of the barn, the kitchen light burning, and she had his breakfast ready without making a ceremony of it. Biscuits and salt pork and strong coffee, and she was wearing a canvas riding coat, and her hair was braided back under a battered hat, and she looked so entirely like a person who knew exactly what needed doing that Tobias found himself glad in a way that was harder and harder to name, just as professional. Miguel Garcia arrived just as the sky was turning from black to the dark blue that precedes the actual dawn. He was a stocky man in his 40s with a calm, weathered face, and he brought his eldest son Rodrigo, who was 19 and had been working cattle since he could walk. Miguel shook Tobias's hand with the practiced evaluation of a man sizing up someone he had not met, and whatever he concluded he kept to himself, but he did not seem displeased. "You are from the bank," Miguel said. It was not a question. "I am," Tobias said. "I'm helping Jane get the herd north." Miguel looked at Jane. Jane looked back with an expression that said this was her business, and she had decided it. Miguel nodded once and went to his horse. Getting 43 Longhorns moving before full daylight was exactly as demanding as Tobias remembered. Longhorns were not docile animals. They had horns that spanned sometimes 6 feet from tip to tip, and they had opinions about direction, and those opinions were frequently wrong. The first 2 hours of the drive were a negotiation conducted in dust and noise, with Jane and Rodrigo flanking the herd and Tobias and Miguel working the drag, pushing the reluctant and the contrary forward. He had not been on a cattle drive in 4 years, and his body reminded him of this repeatedly, but the knowledge came back fast, the way physical knowledge does, and by mid-morning the herd was moving in something like a coherent line north along the trail toward Willow Flat. Jane rode well, better than well. She anticipated the cattle, reading the direction of their heads and the set of their ears before they made their moves, cutting off the brakes before they happened. Her horse was a compact blue roan mare named Cinder, and the two of them moved together with the easy communication of long partnership. Watching her work, Tobias understood something about the way the ranch had survived 2 bad seasons without a husband and without steady hired help. It had survived because she knew what she was doing and she did it without waste. At noon, they stopped along a dry creek bed where a cottonwood provided enough shade to make eating possible. Jane produced biscuits and jerked beef from her saddlebag, and they ate without much talking, the way people eat when they have been working hard. The cattle spread along the dry creek bed, heads down, resting in their way. "You ride like you remember how," Jane said to him, pulling apart a biscuit. "It comes back. Why did you stop?" "The cattle work, I mean." He thought about it. "The bank job paid better, and I was getting old enough to want to know where I would sleep from one night to the next." He paused. "I thought it would be cleaner work." She looked at him sideways. "And is it?" He laughed, a short, surprised sound. "No," he said. "It turns out that collecting debts from people who cannot pay them is considerably less clean than it looks from the outside." She did not say anything to that, but she handed him the larger half of her biscuit without comment, and he took it, and there was something in that small exchange that felt more intimate than it had any right to be. The afternoon was harder. The trail climbed through a section of broken country, where the red clay hills folded in on each other, and the cattle had to be kept close to prevent them scattering into the draws. The heat was significant, the kind of September heat that had not gotten the message that summer was supposed to be over. Tobias's shirt was soaked through by mid-afternoon, and the dust was in everything, his eyes and his lungs and the back of his throat. Miguel and Rodrigo worked the left flank with the efficiency of men who had done this many times, and Jane took the right, and Tobias ranged the drag. One of the older steers, a big red animal with a broken left horn that Jane called Brokhorn with the ease of long familiarity, made 3 separate attempts to leave the herd and investigate a side canyon that probably held a water seep. Tobias turned him back each time, and on the third occasion, Brokhorn turned to look at him with an expression of profound bovine resentment before rejoining the others. "He does that every time," Jane called across the dust when she saw. "He found water in that canyon 2 summers ago and he has not forgotten." "Smart animal," Tobias said. "Too smart," she said. "He keeps the others honest, though. They follow him." They made camp that first night at the base of a rocky outcrop that broke the wind and held the warmth of the day in its stones. Rodrigo built the fire while Miguel set the rope corral for the cattle with a practiced efficiency, and Jane cooked a proper meal over the fire that was better than anything Tobias had expected on a trail camp. Beans with salt pork and dried chilies, corn bread baked in a cast iron skillet with a lid, coffee strong enough to stand up and argue with you. He ate 2 helpings and did not apologize for it. After supper, Miguel and Rodrigo settled at the far side of the fire to talk between themselves in Spanish, and Jane sat with her coffee and her knees drawn up and looked at the stars, which in the Texas panhandle with no town light for 30 miles were the kind of stars that make you feel the specific smallness of a person against the specific enormity of everything else. "You are going to get in trouble with the bank," she said, "when you go back." "Probably," Tobias said. "Does that worry you?" He considered the honest answer. "Less than I thought it would," he said. "That might be a problem in its own right." She turned to look at him. The firelight picked out the angles of her face and made the gray of her eyes impossible to read exactly, which he was finding was often the case with Jane Shepard. She had a way of looking at you that felt like being measured, not unkindly but accurately. "I want to ask you something," she said. "Ask. What did you think when you first rode into the yard, before I came out with the rifle?" He thought about the question. "I thought someone had been working very hard to keep this place together," he said. "The repairs on the fence, the garden, the way the barn roof had been patched, it looked like a person who was fighting." "And what did you think when I came out with the rifle?" "I thought that was a person who knew what the fight actually looked like." The corner of her mouth moved. "My father taught me to always answer the door armed," she said. "He said a woman alone on the frontier who opens a door without a firearm in hand is trusting the goodness of strangers, and while he held a high opinion of human nature in the general, he thought it was a poor thing to bet your life on." "He sounds like a practical man." "He was the most practical man I have ever known," she said, and the fondness in it was edged with grief, the way things are when the person is not long gone. "He would have liked you, I think. He had respect for a person who spoke straight." Tobias felt that land somewhere it was not supposed to land, or rather somewhere he was not supposed to let it land, and he looked at the fire and said, "Tell me more about him." And she did, and the evening passed in her voice and the crack of the fire and the settling sounds of the cattle in their rope corral, and by the time they turned in it felt like he had known her considerably longer than 2 days. The second day on the trail was easier. The herd had accepted their direction, and the country had flattened back out into the high grassland that was easier for the cattle to cover. They made good time, and Tobias found himself falling into the rhythm of the work with something that felt close to happiness, which was not an emotion he had expected to encounter on a cattle drive he had not planned to be on. Midday brought a problem. One of the younger cows had gone lame, a bruised hoof from the rocky country the day before, and she was slowing the herd and becoming agitated. They stopped along a shallow draw where a trickle of water still moved in the bed, and Jane got down and examined the hoof with the calm competence of someone who had done this before. She cleaned it and packed it and wrapped it in strips of cloth from a kit she carried in her saddlebag, talking to the animal in a low, steady voice the whole time. Tobias held the cow's head while she worked, and they were very close together in that operation, close enough that he could smell her hair, which was clean and faintly of wood smoke from the morning's fire. He focused on the cow. "She needs to rest it for a day," Jane said, looking up at him. They were a foot apart. "If I push her, I might lose her." "Then we rest her," Tobias said. "It will cost us half a day. A live cow at the railhead is worth more than a dead one." She held his gaze for a moment, and something moved through her expression that he could not entirely identify except that it was not nothing. "Thank you," she said. It sounded like it was for more than the cow. They set camp early that afternoon in the draw, and Miguel and Rodrigo took the healthy cattle forward a mile to better grass, while Jane stayed with the lame cow and Tobias stayed with Jane, which he told himself was for practical reasons, and which was not entirely for practical reasons. In the quiet of the afternoon, without the noise and dust of the drive, the draw was surprisingly peaceful. The trickle of water was home to a handful of cottonwoods that had gone yellow with the season, and their leaves moved in the breeze with a soft, continuous sound. Jane sat near the cow, which had settled and was grazing the short grass within the length of her tether, and she had taken her hat off, and her hair was escaping its braid at the temples, and she was reading a small book she had taken from her coat pocket. "What are you reading?" Tobias asked, sitting down nearby with his back against a cottonwood trunk. She held it up. "David Copperfield," she said. "I have read it 3 times. I keep a copy in my coat for the cattle drives because the cattle are not demanding company, but the hours are long. You take a lot of cattle drives alone. I have been taking them with Abel for 3 years. This is the first time this season I have been able to get a herd north at all." She paused. "It is also the first time I have had a bank agent help me do it, which I expect is a situation not covered in your professional guidelines." "Conspicuously not covered," he agreed. She looked at him with that measuring look again. "Does it bother you, what you do, the foreclosures?" "Yes," he said, which was the first time he had said it out loud to anyone, and the simplicity of the admission surprised him. "Then why do you keep doing it?" "Because I am good at it," he said, "and because I have not been sure what else I am good at, and because the pay is regular, and because it is easier to keep moving in the direction you are moving than to stop and ask whether it is the right direction." He paused. "None of those are good reasons." "No," she said, "but they are honest ones." She went back to her book, and he sat against the cottonwood and looked at the yellow leaves moving in the breeze, and the afternoon settled around them like something comfortable, like a thing that had been earned rather than given. That evening, Miguel returned with word that there was a river crossing 2 miles ahead that he was not happy about. The September rains upstream had sent more water down than expected, and the crossing at the usual ford was running chest-high on a horse. He wanted to find a better crossing in the morning. "There is one 3 miles downstream," Jane said immediately, "a wide gravel bar. The water spreads out there and goes shallow. My father always used it." Miguel nodded, deferring to her knowledge. Tobias watched the exchange and thought about what the liveryman in Cutter's Creek had said, about how she had been working the herd 6 days a week since March. The liveryman had said it to warn him, to appeal to some feeling of decency he might possess. What the liveryman had not known, perhaps, was that the warning would be unnecessary because the decency in question was not something Tobias had to have appealed to. It was already there, awakening on its own, one conversation and one cattle trail at a time. The gravel bar crossing on the 3rd morning was everything Jane had promised. The river spread wide and flat over the pale stones, and the cattle crossed in a long strung-out line with the water barely reaching their knees, and on the far bank the Texas panhandle grass opened up in a long, gentle rise toward the north that told Tobias they were getting close. "Willow Flat is about 12 miles, he said to Jane as they came up the far bank, water streaming from their horses' legs. "We will make it by tomorrow morning," she said. She had her hat pushed back and the sun was on her face, and she was watching her cattle come up out of the river, and Tobias thought that she looked like someone who was winning, or who was at least fighting on terms she could live with. "Jane," he said. She turned to look at him. "When we get to Willow Flat and you sell the cattle, you are going to have $400, maybe $450 if the market holds. That leaves you roughly $500 short of the full note. I know. The bank is going to push for the full amount. My extension recommendation may not hold. Holly's is not going to like that I spent the week helping you instead of filing the notice." She looked at him without flinching. "I know that too. I want you to think about whether there is any other way to raise the money before you get to the bank, family, anyone who might extend a private loan. She was quiet for a moment. My mother had a sister in Fort Worth, she said. Aunt Clara. We have written, but I have not seen her in years. My father was too proud to ask her for anything. Pride is a fine thing until it costs you a ranch, Tobias said, and the bluntness of it made her blink. Then she nodded. I will write to her from Willow Flat. He nodded and they rode on, and Miguel came alongside him a few minutes later and said quietly, in his direct way, "You are a good man to do this for her." I am a bank agent who has gone considerably off his assigned task, Tobias said. Miguel looked at him steadily. That is not what I said, he said. They drove the last miles to Willow Flat through the late afternoon, arriving at the stockyard pens as the sun was getting low and the buyers were still at work. The stockyard manager, a florid man named Hankins, came out to look at the cattle with the particular expression of a man whose whole face is a negotiating position. Jane stood beside her cattle and did not move while he counted them and assessed them and gave his opening offer, which was $380. $460, Jane said without hesitation. Hankins made a sound of theatrical suffering. Lady, these animals are trail thin. They are longhorn cattle on a trail drive, Jane said. They are supposed to be trail thin. They are also sound and healthy, and you know as well as I do that the Abilene market is paying $18 a head this fall. I have 43 head. You do the arithmetic and tell me what a fair price is. Hankins looked at her. He looked at Tobias. He looked back at Jane. $420, he said. $450, she said. $435, and I am doing you a favor. $440, and we shake hands on it now, she said. They shook hands on $440. Tobias stood slightly behind her and said nothing, because she had not needed him and had known it. When Hankins went to get the cash box, she turned and looked at Tobias with something shining in her expression, something that was triumph, but underneath the triumph was relief, the deep physical relief of a person who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and has just been allowed to set it down for a moment. He did something he had not planned to do. He reached out and took her hand, and she let him, and they stood there in the Willow Flat stockyard with the cattle filing into their pens and the dust settling around them, and held on to each other's hands for a moment that lasted longer than a handshake and meant something neither of them had said yet. She pulled her hand back when Hankins returned with the cash, and she counted it and signed the receipt and tucked the folded bills into the inside pocket of her riding coat. And Tobias thought about the way her hand had felt in his and told himself to be reasonable, which was advice he was finding increasingly difficult to follow. They took rooms at the one hotel in Willow Flat, which was modest but had hot water for washing, and Jane wrote her letter to Aunt Clara, while Tobias filed his preliminary trail report at the telegraph office, informing Clarence Hollies that he had been delayed by circumstances related to the case and would return to Amarillo within 10 days. He did not specify the nature of the circumstances. He expected that conversation to happen in person. The hotel had a dining room, and that evening after the trail grime was washed off and they had slept in actual beds for the first time in 4 days, they sat across from each other at a proper table with a cloth on it, and the difference from the campfire was significant enough to feel almost formal. Jane had changed into a dress dark blue wool with a white collar, and her hair was down from the braid and pinned up at the back of her neck, and she looked very different from the woman who had come out of a ranch house door with a rifle, except that her eyes were the same and the way she held herself was the same, that particular quality of a person who occupies their own life deliberately. "Thank you," she said, when they had ordered and the server had left. "I want to say that properly. Not just for the drive, but for what you told me at the table that first morning, about what the bank is actually doing. I would not have known what I was fighting if you had not told me." "I should not have told you," he said. "I know I am grateful that you did anyway." He looked at her across the table. "Jane," he said, "I want to ask you something." "Ask. When this is over, when we get back to Cutter's Creek and you have sent the $440 to the bank and written to your aunt and done everything that can be done, what happens then? With the ranch, she was quiet for a moment. Then I keep fighting, she said simply. I always keep fighting. That is the only plan I have ever had. It is a good plan, he said. It is not a comfortable plan. No, he looked at his hands on the table. I have been thinking about the bank job, he said carefully. I have been thinking about it for a while, actually, but this week has made me think about it more directly. She watched him. What have you been thinking? That I should stop doing it, he said. That I have been doing it for the wrong reasons and getting worse at it every year, and that at some point a man has to stop going the direction he is going and figure out whether it is the right direction. You said something like that this afternoon, she said, about moving in the direction you are moving. I remember. She held his gaze. So what direction would you go instead? He had not said this out loud before, not to anyone, but the particular quality of this woman's attention made it possible to say things he had not said. I was thinking about cattle work, he said. Not for someone else, my own operation, small to start. I have some savings, not much but enough to start with something. He paused. The panhandle has good grass. When the rains come back, which they always do. Jane Shepard looked at him for a long moment. The dining room around them was full of the ordinary sounds of other people's conversations, the clink of silver, the smell of food, the warm light from the oil lamps. Outside, Willow Flat was doing its nighttime business. That sounds like a man who has been wanting to say something and needed a reason to say it, she said quietly. It might be exactly that, he agreed. She looked at her hands on the table, then back up at him. Tobias, she said, I want to be honest with you. Please, he said. I do not know what this is, she said, gesturing slightly at the space between them with one hand. I do not know what you are offering, or whether you are offering anything, or whether I am imagining things because you helped me when I needed help, and that is a powerful thing, and I am not sure I can trust my own judgment right now. She said it carefully with precision, the way someone speaks when they are being very careful with something fragile. I'm not offering anything, he said. Not yet. I think it would be wrong to offer anything yet when you are in the middle of a crisis and I helped create it by showing up with foreclosure papers. I think that would be taking advantage of a situation. That is very thoughtful, she said. I am trying to be, he said. I am also trying to be honest about the fact that this week has been important to me, and that I would like it to not be the only week. Something moved in her expression that was careful and warm at the same time. I think, she said slowly, that when the bank business is settled and when I know whether the ranch is going to survive and when I can think straight about something that is not money and cattle and survival, I would like to know what this is too. He nodded. Then we will settle the bank business first. Yes, she said, we will. They ate dinner and talked about less consequential things, about the drive and the cattle and Brockhorn's opinions about side canyons, and about the book she was reading, and about the farms he had grown up on and the West Kansas sky, and about all the ordinary things that form the scaffolding of knowing another person. And when they said good night in the corridor and went to their separate rooms, Tobias lay awake for a while looking at the ceiling and thought that he had ridden into Cutter's Creek 3 days ago with a satchel full of papers and some very clear instructions, and he was returning with a great deal of complication and also something that felt, unmistakably, like possibility. The ride back to Cutter's Creek was 2 days. Miguel and Rodrigo had already turned for home, their part done, and so it was only Tobias and Jane on the trail south, which was a different thing from the drive north. Without the cattle and the work, there was more room for conversation, and they used it. They talked the whole of those 2 days, in the way people do when they have found the rare thing of a person who is both interesting and genuinely interested, who asks real questions and gives real answers, and does not fill the silences with noise for the sake of filling them. She told him about her marriage to Will Shepard, which she described with the honesty of someone who has had 4 years to sort through their feelings. He had been a good man, she said, honest and hardworking, but they had married young, both of them at 22, because the frontier life was better lived in pairs, and because they had known each other since childhood and it was the natural thing. She had loved him in the way you love the familiar, the safe, the known. When he died, she had grieved genuinely and for a long time. But she also knew, she said, in the quiet way you know things about yourself that you do not announce publicly, that she had never felt the particular quality of aliveness that some marriages were supposed to contain. Tobias listened without filling in what she had not said, which she appreciated. He told her about his own romantic history, which was sparse and not particularly distinguished. There had been a woman in Amarillo, a schoolteacher named Helen, for about 6 months 2 years ago, but it had ended when she realized he was going to keep riding out to foreclose on people, and she found that morally uncomfortable in a way she could not reconcile. He had understood. He had not been sure he disagreed with her. "Were you heartbroken?" Jane asked. "I was sorry," he said. "I am not sure it was the same thing." "That is honest," she said. "I am trying to only say things to you that are true," he said. "It seems important given everything." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the trail ahead. "It is important," she said. "I have very little patience left for things that are not true. Life is too short for it. Your father taught you that." "My father and the last 4 years," she said. "Between them they made quite an education." They arrived back in Cutter's Creek on a Thursday morning, and Jane went to the telegraph office and sent a money order to the First Cattlemen's Trust of Amarillo for $440, along with a formal letter requesting renegotiation of the remaining balance and citing her intent to pursue additional financing. She had written the letter the night before at the hotel, and she read it to Tobias before she sent it, because he knew the bank's language better than she did, and he had made 2 suggestions that made the legal terms sharper. He had also written his own recommendation to Clarence Holly's, a careful document that cited Jane's demonstrated good faith, her partial payment, and the bank's legal exposure if it proceeded with foreclosure on a partially paid note without exhausting renegotiation options. It was the most favorable case he had ever made for a debtor, and also the most technically accurate one. He filed it the same morning. Before he left Cutter's Creek, he came to the ranch one more time. She was in the yard when he rode in, fixing a section of fence that had gone loose in a post. She looked up when she heard Drum's hooves and dusted her hands on her trousers. "You are leaving," she said. "I need to go back to Amarillo and face whatever is waiting there," he said. "I will know within 2 weeks what the bank's response is going to be. And if they reject the extension, then we find another way," he said. "I am going to speak to a lawyer I know about the terms of the note and whether there is any challenge to the foreclosure process. I do not want to give you false hope. But I want you to know I am not finished with this." She stood looking at him from beside the fence post. "Why?" she asked, and it was the same question she had asked at the kitchen table, but it meant something different now, and they both knew it. "Because I told you I would help," he said, and because he stopped. He had promised himself he would not offer anything premature. He had promised himself he would let the business settle first. But she was standing there in the morning light with her hands dusted with Texas dirt, and her gray eyes full of that quality that was not softness but was not hardness either, and she was waiting for the honest answer. "Because I will think about you every mile of the road to Amarillo," he said, "and I expect that does not surprise either of us." She held his gaze for a long beat. Then she crossed the yard to where he was sitting on Drum, and she held up her hand and he took it, and it was a handshake, but it was also not a handshake. It was a promise of the kind that does not require words. "Come back when you know something," she said. "And Tobias." She squeezed his hand once before she let it go. "Thank you." He rode back toward Amarillo with the sun behind him and the Texas panhandle stretching out ahead, and he thought that the satchel on his saddle still contained the original foreclosure notice for the running S, the official document he had ridden 4 days to deliver and never once taken out to hand over. He thought about that for a while, about the weight of it, about what it meant that he had carried it all this way and never produced it. The meeting with Clarence Hollies went approximately as badly as Tobias had expected, which was to say it was bad but not irreparably bad, which was about the best available outcome. Hollies was a compact, precise man in his 50s who wore his disappointment in the manner of someone who had learned to keep it close and use it carefully. He read Tobias's report and his recommendation without visible reaction, which was itself a kind of reaction. Then he set the papers on his desk and looked at Tobias over his reading glasses. "You spent a week helping a debtor evade her obligations," Hollies said. "I spent a week helping a debtor satisfy her obligations," Tobias said. "She sent $440 by money order. That is not evasion. It is less than half the note. It is demonstrable good faith. And the note's foreclosure terms require us to exhaust renegotiation before we can move to seizure. I have read the terms carefully." Hollies looked at him. Something moved behind his eyes that was not quite respect but was in the neighborhood of it. Tobias knew that Hollies had lost his own ranch to foreclosure years ago. He did not know whether that made Hollies more or less sympathetic to debtors, but he suspected the answer was complicated. "The board will want the full amount," Hollies said. "The board will want the best legal outcome," Tobias said. "A forced foreclosure on a partially paid note following a debtor's good faith partial payment and formal renegotiation request will invite a legal challenge from anyone with a competent lawyer. The legal costs alone would eat the profit from the cattle seizure." Hollies was quiet for a moment. "You have given this some thought," he said. "I have." "The board meets in 3 weeks," Hollies said finally. "I will put the recommendation forward. I cannot promise the outcome." "I know," Tobias said. "I am asking for the chance." He left Hollies' office and went to see the lawyer he had mentioned to Jane, a man named Foster Greer who handled a great deal of banking and land law in Amarillo, and who owed Tobias a favor from a case 2 years ago where Tobias had testified accurately to a timeline that had benefited Greer's client. Greer was a long, elegant man who dressed better than the climate required and had a mind like a well-organized file cabinet. He reviewed the terms of Jane's note and confirmed what Tobias had suspected, that the foreclosure would be on shaky ground if the bank had not fully exhausted the renegotiation provisions. The note's language, which had been drafted somewhat hastily in 1879 by a bank clerk who was apparently better at penmanship than at contracts, gave a debtor in good standing the right to request up to a 90-day extension for partial payment. Jane had made a partial payment. She had formally requested the extension. The bank was, technically, obligated to grant it. Greer wrote a letter to the bank to this effect, citing the specific provision, and sent it by registered mail the following morning. Tobias wrote to Jane that evening. He told her about the legal provision and about Greer's letter and about the board meeting in 3 weeks. He told her to hold on and to write to her Aunt Clara if she had not already. He told her he had looked at the note one more time before putting it in the office files, and he had thought about it, and he wanted her to know he was going to do everything within his power to see this come right. He did not write anything about the other thing. That was a conversation for in person. Her reply came 5 days later, which was fast enough that he knew she had written as soon as she received his letter. She told him she had written to Aunt Clara, and that Clara had written back with a warmth that had made her cry, which she reported without apology. Clara had said she had $400 set aside from the sale of some land she had inherited, and she would send $300 of it to Jane as a loan at no interest, because family did not charge family interest, and that she expected Jane to come to Fort Worth and visit her when the crisis was past. Tobias read that letter 3 times. With Aunt Clara's $300 added to whatever the bank's renegotiation produced, Jane could potentially clear the note entirely. He sat with that for a long time, thinking about what it would mean for her to be free of the debt entirely, and thinking about what it would mean for him. He had already made his decision, actually. He had made it somewhere on the road back from Cutter's Creek, riding through the red clay canyons with the foreclosure notice still in his satchel. He had made it if he was fully honest, at the kitchen table in the running S when a woman had poured him coffee and told him the truth and made it possible for him to tell the truth back. He just had not caught up to it in words until now. He wrote his letter of resignation to the bank the next morning. He wrote it carefully and professionally, and without bitterness, citing his intent to pursue independent ranching in the panhandle and thanking the institution for 3 years of employment. He included, in a separate envelope addressed to Clarence Hollis personally, a frank account of the practices he had observed in the bank's foreclosure operations, specifically the systematic undervaluing of seized cattle for resale to large operations, and the policy of offering 60-day extensions designed to fail. He did not know if Hollis would do anything with that letter. He thought he might. Hollis was a complicated man. He sent both letters, and then he booked passage on the stage to Cutter's Creek, which ran twice a week and took 2 days, and he went to the bank one last time to collect his final wages and to look at the files for Jane's note one more time. He stood at the file cabinet for a long time with the note in his hands, the original document, the piece of paper that represented $940 and a ranch and a woman's life and her father's life before hers. It was a single sheet of paper with the bank's letterhead and the signatures at the bottom, Jane's signature in that steady handwriting he recognized now from her letters, and the bank officer's signature below it, and the terms in dense printed type. He thought about what the note meant and what it had cost her and what it had cost others like her, and he thought about Clarence Hollis going home at night to a house he rented because the house he had built was someone else's now. And he thought about Harold Shepard, who had come to Texas with $40 and built something worth having and then died in December and left his daughter to fight for it alone. Tobias Maddox took the note out of the file and put it in his coat pocket and walked out of the bank. He told himself on the stage north 2 days later that this was a legally complicated thing he had done. The note was a bank document. He had not exactly had the authority to remove it. He was, he thought, probably not going to lose sleep over this, which was itself a kind of answer about what kind of man he was, or had become, or had perhaps always been underneath the 3 years of carrying foreclosure papers to other people's kitchen tables. He arrived in Cutter's Creek on a Tuesday afternoon in October, the sky clear and the air carrying the first real cold of the season, the grassland gone the color of old straw as far as he could see. He stabled Drum, who had been delivered by a colleague back to Amarillo, and who had made the return trip on the stage as freight which had cost considerably more than a passenger ticket. Drum did not seem to hold any of this against him. The road to the running S was familiar now, the mesquite and the dry creek beds, and then the opening of the grassland and the windmill coming into view. He rode into the yard and Jane came out onto the porch, and this time she did not have the rifle. She looked at him for a moment, reading his expression the way she read cattle and weather and the state of the range, with that particular gray-eyed attention that saw things accurately. "What happened?" she said. "Tell me everything." So he tied Drum to the rail and went up onto the porch and told her. He told her about Hollis and about Greer's letter and about the board meeting, which had taken place 3 days ago, and which he had been informed of by a telegraph message from Greer that morning, before he left Amarillo. The board had accepted the renegotiation. They had applied Jane's partial payment of $440 to the note, and granted a 90-day extension on the remaining balance, which with Aunt Clara's $300 would bring the total to $740 of the $940 owed. The remaining $200 had been the subject of a negotiation that Greer had conducted with considerable legal precision, citing the note's defective drafting, and the bank had agreed to accept $740 as full settlement. Jane sat down on the porch step while he told her this, and by the end she had her hands pressed flat on her knees and she was very still. "It is settled," she said. "Greer will have the final paperwork within the week. When Clara's money arrives and you send the additional $300 to the bank, the note is closed. The running S is clear." She was quiet for a long moment, and he sat down beside her on the step, and the October wind moved through the mesquite along the fence line, and the cattle in the near pasture stood in the long afternoon light. "I cannot believe it," she said finally. "Believe it," he said. She turned to look at him, and her eyes were bright in a way that was not quite tears but was adjacent to them, the brightness of a person who has been holding something very tight for a very long time and is only now starting to release the grip. "How did you do this?" she said. "Tobias, how did you manage all of this?" "Greer did the legal work," he said. "Clara gave the loan. You drove 43 cattle 60 miles and sold them for $440. And you," she said, "what did you do?" He reached into his coat pocket and took out the note, the original document, the single sheet of bank letterhead with her signature at the bottom, and he held it out to her. She took it and looked at it for a long moment, recognizing what it was. "This is the original note," she said. "This is not supposed to be in my hands." "No," he agreed. "Tobias. There will be a new document from Greer, the settlement agreement. That will be the legal record. This," he gestured at the note in her hands. "This is just paper." She looked at him, and then she looked down at the note, and then she did something he had not expected. She tore it in half, cleanly and deliberately, right down the middle, and then she tore those halves again, and again, until the pieces were small, and then she let them go from her open hands, and the October wind took them in a scatter across the yard, white specks of bank letterhead tumbling into the dust and the grass and the Texas afternoon. Tobias watched the pieces of paper blow away and felt something in his chest that he had no word for except that it was right. "I resigned from the bank," he said. She turned to look at him sharply. "What?" "3 days ago, before I came. I did not want to come back here while I was still employed by the institution that has been trying to take your ranch." She was looking at him very carefully. "That is a significant thing to do," she said. "I know. What will you do now?" "I told you," he said. "I have been thinking about cattle, a small start. The panhandle is good land when the rains come back." He paused. "I thought I might look for land in this county. I am familiar with the area." Jane Shepard looked at him for a long, long moment. The afternoon light was going golden the way it does in October in Texas, the particular gold of a season changing, and it lay across the porch and across her face and across the distance between them on the step. "Tobias Maddox," she said, "are you telling me you are planning to stay in Cutter's Creek?" "I am considering it," he said. "I did not want to assume anything." "You rode back here from Amarillo with the original deed of my debt in your coat pocket," she said. "That is not a neutral action. That is not the action of a man who is undecided." "No," he said, "I suppose it is not." She was quiet for another moment. Then she said, in a voice that was careful and also absolutely steady, "I told you in Willow Flat that when the business was settled and I could think clearly, I would want to know what this is." "You did," he said. "The business is settled." "It is." "Then I will tell you what I think this is," she said. She turned to face him on the step, and her gray eyes were clear and direct. "I think you are a man who came to this ranch to do a job he hated and instead did the right thing. And I think that is the truest thing I have seen in a very long time. And I think I have been half in love with you since that first morning when you sat at my kitchen table and told me the truth when you did not have to." He did not move for a moment, absorbing that. Then he said, "Half." She almost smiled. "The other half arrived somewhere around the river crossing," she said, "when you told me a live cow was worth more than a dead one." He laughed, a real laugh, the kind that came from somewhere deep and genuine, and she laughed with him. And then he stopped laughing, and he was very close to her, and the October light was golden on her face, and her gray eyes were warm in a way he was not sure he had ever seen in them before. "Jane," he said, "may I?" She reached up and put her hand against his jaw, very gently, and kissed him. It was not tentative. It was a person who has decided something and is not apologizing for the decision. He put his hand over hers where it rested against his face and kissed her back, and the October wind moved through the yard and stirred the white scraps of foreclosure paper in the dust, and the cattle stood in their pasture, and the running S settled around them in the long golden light. When they parted, She sat back and looked at him, and there was that particular quality in her expression, the one he had first noticed at the kitchen table and had been trying to name ever since. He understood now what it was. It was a person who had decided to trust someone. It was not naive and it was not careless. It was deliberate and considered and freely given, and it was one of the bravest things he had ever seen. "Sit a spell," she said. "I will make coffee." He sat on the porch in the October afternoon and listened to her move in the kitchen behind him, and watched the last of the paper scraps blow across the yard, and thought that he had ridden into this place with a satchel full of bad news, and had somehow, in the space of 10 days and the length of a cattle drive, arrived at something he had not known he was looking for. He had found it nonetheless. They courted through the autumn of 1882 in the way of the frontier, which meant he took a room at the boarding house in Cutter's Creek, and came out to the ranch most days to help with the work while he looked for land of his own, and they ate supper together most evenings and rode out on Sundays when the work allowed, and talked, always talked, the way they had talked on the cattle trail and at the campfire, and at the hotel table in Willow Flat. He found a parcel of land 4 miles west of the running S in November, 160 acres with good grass and a reliable spring, available under the Homestead Act. He filed on it the same week he found it. The land was unimproved, which meant winter would be hard work, but he had experience with hard work, and the satisfaction of building something was a thing he had been missing without knowing it. Miguel Garcia helped him with the first fence line on a Saturday in early November, and Rodrigo helped him set the posts, and Jane rode over in the afternoon and walked the perimeter of the claim with him in the cold, bright air, pointing out where the spring drainage ran and where the grass came in thickest after rain. "Your cattle are going to have an easy crossing to my south pasture," she said. "I noticed that," he said. "Is that why you picked this parcel?" "It was a consideration," he said, and she gave him a look that meant she knew he was being modest and found it amusing. He proposed to her in December, on the porch of the running S, on a night when the first proper cold had come down from the north and they were wrapped in their coats, and the stars were the winter stars, harder and brighter than the summer ones, and the lamplight from the kitchen window made a warm square on the boards of the porch floor. He had thought about elaborate arrangements, and had decided against them, because elaborate arrangements were not who either of them was. He had thought about what to say for about 2 weeks and had ultimately decided that what he wanted to say was the simplest true thing available. "Jane," he said, "I want to build a life with you, not just adjacent to you, not just on the neighboring claim, with you. This ranch and my land together, and a partnership that is all the way through, the practical kind and the other kind. I want to marry you if you will have me." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the winter stars. Then she said, "I have been waiting for you to ask since about mid-November." "Why did you not ask me?" he said. "Because I was enjoying watching you work up to it," she said, and turned to him with that full smile, the one that rearranged things, and said, "Yes, Tobias, I will have you." They were married in February of 1883, in the small church in Cutter's Creek that had been built by the community 2 years prior, and that smelled of cedar and candle wax, and the particular cold of an unheated building in winter. The minister was a traveling Methodist named Reverend Crane, who came through the county on a monthly circuit, and who married them in a ceremony of 20 minutes that was simple and exact and felt, to Tobias, like the most important 20 minutes of his life. Miguel and Maria Garcia came, and their 4 children, and the liveryman from Cutter's Creek whose name turned out to be Frank Desmond, who shook Tobias's hand with considerable warmth and said he was glad someone had finally done something sensible. Aunt Clara came from Fort Worth on the stage, which was a 2-day journey, and she and Jane held each other for a long time at the door of the church, and Tobias stood back and gave them the space that was theirs. Clara was a stout, warm woman in her 60s with Jane's same direct gaze, and she took Tobias's hand in both of hers after the ceremony and said, "You are exactly what she needed, and I expect she is exactly what you needed, and I am very pleased." "Yes, ma'am," he said, "on both counts." They moved Jane's things from the running S into the combined household that first spring, which mostly meant they simply used both houses for the work they were suited to. The running S for the main living since it had more room, and Tobias's place for the storage and the equipment that the combined operation needed. The two properties together made a respectable operation, 100 acres of his claim and the original running S land, and they ran the cattle as a single herd. The rains came back that spring, which felt like the world making a gesture. The grass came up thick and green across the panhandle, and the cattle put on weight and the prices in Abilene recovered. By fall they drove 61 head to Willow Flat and sold them for $11 a head, and the profit was enough to build a proper bunkhouse on the running S and hire on Abel Coates, who had left the 3-bar and was looking for work he could believe in. Abel Coates was a wiry man in his 40s who chewed tobacco and spoke rarely but worked with an economy of effort that was a pleasure to observe, and he was clearly loyal to Jane in the way that people who have worked for someone good for a long time are loyal, the kind of loyalty that has been earned on both sides. He shook Tobias's hand on his first day and said, "She told me about what you did, with the note and the bank." "She drove the cattle and sold them," Tobias said. "I just helped." Abel looked at him steadily. "Yes, sir," he said, in a tone that communicated he knew more about it than that and thought well of Tobias for not boasting about it. And then he went to work, and that was that. Clarence Hollies left the bank in the spring of 1883, which Tobias heard about through a letter from Foster Greer, who kept him informed about Amarillo affairs. The letter Tobias had written to Hollies had apparently been forwarded to the bank's board, with a covering letter from Hollies himself, citing irregularities in the foreclosure resale practices. 2 of the board members had resigned. The bank had made quiet settlements with 3 ranchers who had lost cattle in the previous 2 years. Greer did not say what had happened to Hollies afterward, but Tobias hoped that wherever he had gone somewhere he could sleep at night. Jane had her first child, their son, in January of 1884. They named him Harold for her father, and he arrived in the middle of a January ice storm with the help of Maria Garcia, who had delivered most of the children born in that county for the past decade, and who was calm and competent and made very good coffee, which she brought in a pot as soon as it was over, and Tobias was sitting in the kitchen chair, not entirely sure his legs worked. Maria set the coffee in front of him and patted his shoulder and said, "You did well for a man who had no idea what to do." "What did I do?" he said. He honestly could not recall doing anything useful. "You stayed," she said. "That is what they need, the staying." Harold Shepard Maddox was born healthy and loud, and he had his mother's gray eyes and his father's brown hair, and from the first hour of his life he had an opinion about everything, which Jane said was predictable given his parents. Tobias sat in the low light of the bedroom while Jane slept, holding his son for the first time, and looked at the small face and felt something so large and wordless that he could not have said what it was except that it was the cumulative weight of everything. The road from Amarillo and the kitchen table and the cattle drive and the river crossing and the porch in the October light and the wedding in the cold church and all the mornings and evenings and ordinary good days since. All of it arriving at this single January night with a child in his arms who was his and Jane's and new. He looked at the photograph on the wall, Harold Shepard's hand resting on his wife's shoulder with that quiet tenderness. He thought about the man who had built this ranch from nothing, who had raised a daughter who held her own on a frontier that was not designed to be held by anyone, who had died before he could see what she would make of everything he had left her. "Your grandfather would have been glad," he said softly to the sleeping baby, who was indifferent to this information but who Tobias thought deserved to hear it anyway. Harold was 3 years old when his sister was born, in the summer of 1887. They named her Clara, for Jane's aunt who had sent the loan that had helped save the ranch, and Clara Maddox arrived in July with considerably less drama than her brother had, in sunshine and warmth, and was a serene and observant baby who watched the world from the first with a quality of attention that made Jane say she recognized it. "She has your eyes," Jane told Tobias. "She has your way of looking," he said. By the time Clara was walking, Harold was following Abel Coates around the ranch with the total devotion of a small boy who has decided that cattle are the most important things in the world. Abel bore this with considerable patience and taught Harold to identify the cattle by temperament, which was Tobias's favorite kind of knowledge, practical and specific and impossible to learn from a book. Aunt Clara came from Fort Worth every spring to visit, and these visits were among the best weeks of the year, full of good food and long evenings on the porch, and Clara telling stories about Jane's mother, who had been her sister, stories that Jane had never heard because she had been too young when her mother died to have collected them. Tobias would sit and listen to these stories with his coffee and watch his wife's face as she heard things about her mother she had not known, and think about the way time held people and what it gave back when you were patient with it. The Running S grew steadily through the late 1880s. They added a second water tank in 1886 and expanded the herd to 120 head by 1888. They hired a second hand in addition to Abel, a young man from San Antonio named Louis Barrera, who was quick with horses and good with a rope, and who brought his mother's tamale recipe to the ranch kitchen, which Jane declared a significant improvement to the culinary situation. The panhandle settled around them during those years, the way a frontier settles, slowly and unevenly but in one direction. The town of Cutter's Creek got a proper general store and then a school, and Jane served on the school board from its founding, because education was something she considered non-negotiable, and she argued for a school curriculum that included history taught accurately, which meant acknowledging what had been done to the Comanche and the other peoples whose land the Panhandle had been. And she argued this in the plain, direct way she argued everything, with facts and without apology. There were people who disagreed with her. There were people who always disagreed with her about something, because she was a woman who spoke plainly and had opinions and ran a successful ranch, and that combination caused irritation in certain quarters of Cutter's Creek that had never fully resolved. Tobias had more than once sat through suppers where someone said something about Jane's ranch management or her school board positions that required him to say a careful, firm thing in response. He was not a man given to confrontation, but he was also not a man who let things pass that should not pass. Jane told him once, after one such evening, that she appreciated it but did not need it. "I know you do not need it," he said. "I am not doing it because you need it. I am doing it because it is true and because some things deserve to be said out loud by whoever is in the room." She looked at him with that expression he had come to know as well as any landscape, the one that held warmth and precision in equal measure, and she said, "You are a good man, Tobias Maddox." "I am trying to be," he said, which was what he always said to that, because it was the most honest answer available. Harold turned 5 in January of 1889 and started school that fall, and he was on a horse by himself at 4, and handling cattle at 5 with an ease that made the cowhands shake their heads in the way of people observing something they recognize as natural talent. He had Jane's gray eyes and Jane's stubbornness, and a wide, curious intelligence about the natural world. And Tobias loved him in the specific way you love a child who is very much their own person, with admiration layered under the love. Clara was different in her nature, quieter and more interior, with a habit of watching situations before entering them that Tobias recognized as his own. She loved the cattle well enough, but what she loved more were the horses, and she had a way with them from very young that was remarkable, a quality of patience and attention that horses responded to with an alacrity that bordered on the philosophical. Louis Barrera said it was a gift and could not be taught, and Tobias believed him. In the spring of 1890, a letter arrived from Foster Greer in Amarillo. The First Cattlemen's Trust had been reorganized following several years of legal and regulatory pressure, and the new board was reaching out to former clients who had been treated unfairly in the foreclosure process to offer modest settlements. Jane was owed, Greer wrote, a renegotiation payment of $60 for costs and distress related to the bank's improper foreclosure proceedings against the Running S in 1882. Jane read the letter at the kitchen table with Tobias across from her, and when she finished she looked up with an expression that held both amusement and a kind of deep tiredness. $60, she said. For everything they put you through, he said. She looked at the letter for another moment. Then she said, I am going to donate it to the school. Good, he said. She set the letter down and picked up her coffee cup and looked out the window at the October light on the pasture, the same pasture where 43 longhorns had stood in 1882 waiting to be driven north by a woman with a plan and a bank agent with a bad conscience. Tobias, she said. Yes. Do you know what I thought the first morning, when you were sitting at this table and you started telling me the truth about the bank? What did you think? I thought this man is either going to save everything or complicate everything, and I could not tell which. She smiled. It turned out to be both. It did, he said. I stand by it. She reached across the table and put her hand over his, and they sat that way in the October morning in the kitchen of the Running S, with the biscuits in the oven and the children at school and the cattle in the pasture and the life they had made together settled around them like the land itself, shaped by water and weather and time, difficult and permanent and entirely their own. Harold came home that fall with a new friend from school, a boy named Joseph, who was the son of a farmer who had come to the panhandle from Tennessee the previous year. Joseph came for supper and stayed half the week with the uncomplicated ease of children, and the farmhouse expanded to accommodate him as it had expanded to accommodate everything, with Jane's particular gift for making room. They raised their children on the Running S through the last years of the 1880s and into the 1890s, and those years had the quality of good years, not without difficulty, because the panhandle was never without difficulty, but with the difficulty properly shared and properly met. Two people who had learned each other thoroughly and trusted each other completely and still, after 7 years and 2 children and 100 seasons of work, found each other interesting. There was a drought in 1892 that took them back to the edge of hard times, and they reduced the herd and found ways to carry it through the dry year, and they were not broke but they were careful, and they were careful together, which was entirely different from being careful alone. When the rains came back in 1893, they were still standing, which was the necessary thing. Harold was 9 that year, a serious-eyed boy who already talked about the ranch as something he intended to take care of, and Tobias watched this and felt the particular satisfaction of a thing being passed on that was worth passing. Clara was 6 and had taught herself to braid rope from the scraps in the barn, which no one had taught her, and which she produced one morning to considerable general surprise. In the evenings, when the work was done and the children were in bed, Tobias and Jane sat on the porch or at the kitchen table and talked or read or sat in the companionable silence that is the particular luxury of people who know each other well enough to not need to fill it. He had brought his small library of books from Amarillo, and it had merged with her collection on the shelves, and the shelf was one of his favorite things about the kitchen, its accumulated evidence of a life built from more than one person's mind. She had kept her copy of David Copperfield. He had found a newer one in an Amarillo bookshop the first spring and given it to her with the note, "For the long cattle drives, of which I intend to accompany you on all future ones." She had kept that note inside the front cover. One evening in the spring of 1893, they were sitting on the porch after supper, the air warm and smelling of the new grass and the bluebonnets that had come up along the fence line, and the children were inside, and the cattle were quiet, and the whole panhandle was settling into its evening, and Jane turned to look at him in the particular way she had when she was about to say something she had been sitting with. I was thinking today about the morning you rode in, she said. Which morning? The first one. With the satchel. I was thinking about that morning too recently, he said. I was thinking I should have been worried about the professional implications of what I was about to do, and instead I was worried about whether you had eaten breakfast. She looked at him with amusement. Why were you worried about whether I had eaten breakfast? Because you had flour on your apron, which meant you had been baking, and you came out so fast I thought you had not stayed to eat what you made, and it seemed like a bad morning to not have eaten. She was quiet for a moment, something in her expression soft and wondering. You noticed that, she said. I notice most things about you, he said. It is a habit I acquired early and have not seen a reason to break. She leaned her head against his shoulder, which was a thing she did sometimes in the evenings when the work was done and the world was quiet. He put his arm around her. What do you think would have happened, she said, if you had just served the papers and left, the way you were supposed to? He thought about it honestly. The bank would have foreclosed within 60 days, he said. You would have lost the cattle and probably the ranch. And I would have ridden back to Amarillo and filed my report and told myself it was just business, and I would have believed it less than I had believed it before, and eventually I would have become the kind of man who has convinced himself that distance from harm is the same as not causing it. She was quiet for a moment. I am glad you did not leave, she said. So am I, he said. Every day. The spring evening settled around them. The last of the light going rose and gold along the horizon, the windmill turning slowly in the easy breeze, the cattle moving through the pasture in their unhurried way, the children's voices coming faint and warm from inside the house. 11 years since a man had ridden into this yard with a satchel full of bad news and sat down at a kitchen table and told the truth, and the truth had made, out of all its complications and its costs, something that felt, on an evening like this, like everything. In the summer of 1893, Aunt Clara died in Fort Worth at the age of 71, peacefully in her sleep, which was the kind of death you hoped for if you could not prevent one. Jane traveled to Fort Worth for the burial and came back with her aunt's Bible and a small miniature painting of Jane's mother as a young woman, and she set the miniature on the shelf beside the photograph of her parents and stood there looking at both of them for a while. Tobias stood behind her and put his hands on her shoulders and did not say anything, because there was nothing to say that the silence did not already hold better. She leaned back against him. She said in her last letter that she was happy, Jane said. She said that getting to see the ranch and the children had given her something she had not expected to have. She was a generous woman, he said. She was, Jane said. I want to be that. When I am old, I want to be someone who gave people things they did not expect to have. He turned her gently to face him. You already are, he said. And he meant the children and the ranch and the school board and Miguel Garcia and his family and Abel and Louis and all the ordinary daily generosity of a woman who had been given very little help and had found ways to share what she had. He meant, too, what she had given him, though he did not say that part because she knew it, and things you both know do not always need to be spoken. He kissed her forehead and she closed her eyes for a moment, and then she took a breath and straightened and said, Supper is going to burn if I do not go see to it, and went to the kitchen, and life went forward, the way it does, in the direction of ordinary things. Harold was 12 when he began riding the full fence line on his own, a job that Tobias had done himself for the first years, and then with Harold alongside, teaching him the sections and the trouble spots and how to carry wire and post tools, and how to know whether a repair would hold or whether it needed to be redone properly. The boy absorbed it all with a thoroughness that made Tobias's chest tight in the particular way of pride that is inseparable from love. Clara at 9 was her own person, quiet and decisive, with a circle of 3 girls from school who came to the ranch on Saturdays, and who Clara led on long rides into the grassland on horses she managed with that uncanny ease. Jane watched her daughter ride and said once to Tobias, "She is going to do something unexpected with her life." "Something good?" he asked. "Something great," Jane said, with the serene confidence of a mother who knew her child. "I just cannot see the shape of it yet." In the fall of 1894, Tobias's brother William came to visit from Kansas, the first family Tobias had seen in years. William was 4 years older and had made his own life in a different direction, working as a surveyor, and he came with his wife and his 2 older boys on the stage from Amarillo with the air of a man prepared to be impressed. He was, in fact, impressed in the way that happens when you have not seen someone in a long time, and the life they have built exceeds what you imagined for them. William and Jane took to each other immediately, in the way that 2 practical, direct people recognize each other and settle into ease. By the second evening, he was calling her Jane without ceremony, and she was showing him the ranch records with the frank openness of someone who had nothing to hide and everything to be proud of. "She is exactly right for you," William told Tobias on their 3rd morning, the 2 of them out at the fence line on a repair that did not technically need 2 people, but that gave them the excuse to be out together in the early light in the way brothers sometimes need an excuse for the things they actually want to say. "I know it," Tobias said. "You seem," William said and paused, searching for the word, "resolved." Tobias thought about the word. "I think that is exactly it," he said. "Resolved. Like a thing that was a question and is now an answer." William looked at the cattle in the pasture and at the windmill and at the line of the horizon where the panhandle went on forever in its flat, magnificent way. "You ended up somewhere good, Tobias," he said. "I did," Tobias said. "I found it by accident, and I have been grateful for the accident ever since." The family visit lasted a week, and when William and his family left on the stage, Tobias watched them go from the street in Cutter's Creek with Jane beside him and Harold and Clara pushing against his legs with the exuberant impatience of children who have enjoyed company and are now ready to go home. And he put one hand on Harold's shoulder and the other around Jane's waist, and thought that this was the whole of it, this right here, the completeness that he had not known to look for and had found anyway. The years settled around the running S in the measured way of good years, each one building on the one before. They expanded the herd to 150 by 1895 and built a proper ice house that summer, which was a considerable luxury by the standards of the Panhandle, and one that Jane had researched and planned with characteristic thoroughness, corresponding with a rancher in Colorado who had built one and extracting from him every detail of its construction. Harold at 14 was already the height of his father and considerably more earnest, the kind of boy who kept a journal and read everything available and asked questions about everything until the person he was asking had run out of answers and had to go find more. Tobias arranged for him to correspond with Foster Greer in Amarillo, who had a son Harold's age and who was also a resource for books that were not available in Cutter's Creek, and the correspondence became a weekly event that Harold took very seriously. Clara at 11 had decided she was going to breed horses. She had made this announcement at supper one October evening with the calm finality of a person reporting a geological fact, and neither Tobias nor Jane had found anything to say against it, partly because it was a sound business idea, and partly because arguing with Clara on a matter she had decided was a project with a predictable outcome. "We will need to think about what stallion to bring in," Jane said, as though they had been discussing it for weeks. "I have been looking at some information on quarter horses," Clara said. "Louis said his cousin in San Antonio knows a man with good breeding stock." Tobias put his fork down and looked at his daughter, who was 11 years old and had already identified her supply chain, and then he looked at Jane, who was looking back at him with an expression that said, very clearly, "This is your contribution to her character and I am pleased about it. Write to Louis's cousin," he said to Clara, "and show me the information you found." She produced the information from under her chair, which meant she had had it there the whole time, ready for the moment he asked, and Tobias thought again about the particular quality of aliveness that Jane had once described as absent from her first marriage, and felt it so present in this life, this kitchen, these children, this woman across the table, that it seemed unreasonable for one person to hold so much of it. The winter of 1896 brought a cold that settled hard on the panhandle and kept them close to the ranch for 3 weeks. And those 3 weeks were among the warmest of Tobias's memory in the way that forced closeness is when the closeness is with people you love. They played cards and read aloud and told stories, and Harold taught himself, from a pamphlet from the Cutter's Creek General Store, the basics of chess, and he taught them all, and Clara was better at it than anyone within a week, which surprised no one. Jane read to the children in the evenings from her library, Dickens and Cooper and Washington Irving, and a book of folk tales that had belonged to her mother. And Tobias sat and listened and thought about the photograph on the wall, Jane's parents, the hand on the shoulder, and about the way one generation's love makes the next generation possible. When the cold finally broke and the world opened back up and the cattle were still sound and the spring was coming, he went out early one morning before anyone else was awake and stood at the fence looking across the running S in the first pale light, the grass beginning its return, the windmill turning in the cold, clean air, the faint outline of his own claim visible to the west, and thought about where he had been and what he had done and what had been made of it. He had been a bank agent with a satchel full of papers, and a job he was no longer sure he could do. He had ridden to a ranch expecting to foreclose on a note and had instead sat down at a kitchen table and told the truth and had his coffee poured for him. And from that single morning had come 11 years of mornings, each one built on the one before. He had torn up no note, technically. Jane had torn it. But he had handed it to her to tear, which was the part that mattered, and he thought about that sometimes, the strange adequacy of that gesture. How much a person could change the shape of a life by choosing, at the one available moment, to hand something over rather than hold it back. Brokhorn was still in the herd, which was remarkable for a long-horn steer of his age, and he still had his opinions about side canyons, and he still walked at the front of the others when they moved, and Tobias greeted him most mornings as a matter of respect for a fellow who had been there since the beginning. He heard the door of the house open behind him, and Jane came out in her coat and boots with 2 cups of coffee, because she always heard him when he got up before anyone else, and she always came out, and he thought that was the truest possible thing about their marriage, that particular quality of attention, the way she knew his presence even in sleep and came to find him. She stood beside him at the fence and handed him his coffee, and they looked at the ranch together in the early light, and after a while she said, "What are you thinking about?" "The morning I rode in," he said, "the first one." "You think about that morning often," she said. "I think about it because it was the day everything changed," he said. "I think it deserves to be thought about." She leaned her shoulder against his. "Everything changed for me too," she said, "in case I have not said that clearly enough." "You have said it clearly enough," he said. "I like hearing it anyway." She looked out at the herd, at Brokhorn standing broad and opinionated in the early light, at the grass coming back, at the land that was theirs and their children's after them, and she said, "I am glad you did not just serve the papers and leave." "I am glad every day," he said. "Every single day." The sun came up over the eastern edge of the panhandle and laid its long gold light across the running S, and the cattle moved in it, and the windmill turned, and inside the house Harold and Clara would be waking to their morning, and the ranch would begin its day, the way it began every day, with the 2 of them side by side and the work waiting and the life fully, irreversibly, gratefully their own. Tobias put his arm around Jane and she leaned into him, and they stood that way in the morning light and did not need to say anything else, because everything worth saying had already been said, and everything worth having had already been made, and the ranch spread out around them in the golden October air of the Texas panhandle, good and lasting and complete.